1 month after I paid $80,000 for my only daughter's wedding, my phone rang. I am Stephen, 71 years old, and until that moment, I believed I had secured a peaceful and quiet retirement. The caller was Evan, the wedding photographer. His voice was shaking so badly, I could barely understand him. He told me he was editing the final batch of reception photos and noticed something absolutely terrible. He demanded I come to his downtown studio immediately. He was absolutely adamant that I not say a single word to my daughter about the call. What he showed me on his computer screen that afternoon completely shattered my reality. Before I tell you exactly what I saw in that photograph, let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever trusted the wrong person and had to fight ruthlessly to get your life back. I was standing in my garage when Evan called. I had just finished cleaning the engine components of an old truck. My hands were covered in thick black grease and motor oil. I have worked hard my entire life, starting as a frontline mechanic and eventually building and selling a chain of successful auto repair shops. That was how I built my wealth. I wiped my hands on a rough shop towel and answered the ringing phone. Evan did not even say hello. He just asked if I was alone in the house. I told him I was alone. Then he gave me his address and told me to drive over as fast as the speed limit allowed. I dropped the dirty towel directly onto the wooden workbench. I did not even bother washing my hands. I grabbed my car keys from the pegboard and got straight into my vehicle. My chest felt incredibly tight. My mind immediately raced through a dozen terrible and frightening scenarios. I wondered if someone had been hurt at the reception. I wondered if there was some sort of hidden camera in the dressing rooms. I had absolutely no idea what to expect. But the sheer panic in the young photographer's voice told me this was not a simple misunderstanding regarding the final invoice. This was something deeply wrong. I backed out of my driveway without looking back. The drive from my suburban house to the downtown commercial district took exactly 28 minutes. It felt like 4 hours. I gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. The afternoon sun was glaring through the windshield, making the heavy traffic seem even more oppressive. I kept the radio turned off. The silence inside the cabin of my car was deafening. Every time I stopped at a red light, I tapped my foot anxiously against the floorboard. I focused entirely on the road ahead, refusing to let my mind wander into the past. I did not think about my daughter Natalie in her beautiful white dress. I did not think about the proud tears I cried when I walked her down the church aisle. I only thought about the trembling pitch of Evan's voice. I navigated through the busy city intersections, dodging delivery trucks and impatient commuters. I pulled into a narrow alleyway behind Evan's brick studio building. I parked my car directly in a loading zone, not caring at all if I received a parking ticket. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet car for just a few seconds. I took one deep breath to steady my racing heart. Then I opened the door and stepped out into the humid city air. I walked up to the heavy metal security door at the back of the building and pressed the buzzer. Evan opened the door almost immediately. He looked terrible. His face was entirely pale, and he had dark circles under his eyes, as if he had not slept in days. He ushered me inside quickly and locked the deadbolt behind me. The studio smelled strongly of fresh coffee and the ozone from large electronic devices. The main room was entirely dark, except for the glow of 2 massive computer monitors sitting on a large wooden desk. Evan did not offer me a seat. He did not offer me a drink. He walked straight over to the desk and pointed a trembling finger at the right monitor. He explained that he was reviewing the candid background shots from the reception. He said he had left a camera on a tripod in the main hallway, near the private dressing rooms, set to automatically take a picture every 10 seconds to capture guests walking by. The photo displayed on the glowing screen was taken at exactly 8:45 in the evening. It was a picture of the heavy wooden door leading to the groom's private suite. The door was not fully closed. There was a gap of about 4 inches. Through that narrow vertical crack, the camera had captured a perfectly focused, high-resolution slice of the room inside. I leaned closer to the large monitor. The lighting inside the suite was harsh and bright. I saw my new son-in-law, Matthew. He was sitting at a glass table. Standing right behind him, leaning over his shoulder, was his father, Paul. Neither of them was smiling. They both had expressions of intense, calculated focus. Matthew was typing rapidly on a silver laptop. Paul was holding a small rectangular object in his right hand. I squinted at the screen. Resting on the glass table right next to the silver laptop was a black leather wallet and a cell phone. The cell phone had a very distinct, heavy-duty protective case. It was dark green with a bright orange border. My stomach dropped completely. It felt like I had swallowed a heavy lead weight. I recognized that phone case instantly. It was my phone. I stared at the digital image, completely frozen in place. The memory of the wedding reception rushed back into my mind with absolute clarity. The loud music, the flashing lights, the endless stream of distant relatives shaking my hand. I distinctly remembered reaching into the interior pocket of my tailored suit jacket to check the time. My pocket had been completely empty. I remembered feeling a sudden rush of mild panic. I am an older man, and my entire life is managed through that device. I had immediately started searching the dining tables and asking the waitstaff if they had seen it. Matthew had walked over to me. He had placed a firm, reassuring hand on my shoulder. He told me to calm down and enjoy the party. He promised me that he would personally check the private suites and the bathrooms for my phone. He had told me to just sit back and drink my champagne. I had trusted him entirely. My phone remained missing for exactly 2 hours. It mysteriously reappeared at the valet stand at the very end of the night. The attendant claimed he found it resting on a chair near the coat check. I had been so relieved that I gave the attendant a $100 tip. Now standing in the dark photography studio, the truth slammed into me with devastating force. My phone had never been lost. It had been intentionally stolen from my jacket pocket in the middle of a crowded room. And the men who stole it were the men who had just officially joined my family. Evan grabbed the computer mouse. He looked up at me with profound apology in his eyes. He clicked the mouse wheel, and the image on the large screen magnified significantly. The pixels blurred for a fraction of a second before the software rendered the image in sharp, terrifying detail. The camera angle was just right to capture the reflection of the silver laptop screen in the glass surface of the table. Evan applied a digital filter to enhance the contrast and reverse the mirrored image. Suddenly, the interface on the laptop became completely legible. It was not a social media page. It was not a wedding registry. It was the secure private portal of my primary wealth management bank. The bright blue header logo was unmistakable. Evan zoomed in further, focusing on the small rectangular object Paul was holding in his hand. It was my driver's license pulled directly from my stolen black leather wallet. Finally, Evan dragged the magnified view over to my dark green cell phone resting on the table. The screen of the phone was illuminated. A bright white notification banner was displayed prominently across the lock screen. It was an automated text message from my bank displaying a 6-digit security code for 2-factor authentication. I stood in the dark studio and stopped breathing. Matthew and Paul were not just looking at my accounts. They were actively bypassing the highest level of bank security while I was out in the ballroom celebrating my daughter's happiness. They had used my stolen identification and my stolen phone to authorize a massive financial transaction. They had bypassed the security protocols by entering the exact code displayed in the photograph. I did not need to see anything else. I knew exactly what they had done. I had been completely robbed by the man who had sworn to protect my daughter. The conflict had officially begun. I left the photography studio without saying another word to Evan. I walked into the humid city afternoon and got directly into my car. My hands were no longer shaking. They were perfectly still. The initial shock had completely evaporated, replaced by a cold and heavy realization. I did not drive back to my house. I drove directly to the main branch of my wealth management bank. The drive took exactly 15 minutes. I spent every single second of that drive mentally cataloging my assets. I had worked my entire life to build a secure foundation for my family. I had paid off the mortgage on my estate 10 years ago. I had properly funded all of my retirement accounts. I had trusted the system to keep my life safe. I parked my car in the pristine concrete lot of the bank and walked through the heavy glass doors. The inside of the bank was a sharp contrast to the chaotic emotions churning inside my chest. It was aggressively sterile. The air conditioning was freezing. The marble floors gleamed brightly under the fluorescent lights. The quiet murmur of tellers processing routine deposits sounded like a foreign language. I walked straight past the main line and approached the front desk receptionist. I told her I needed to speak with a senior manager regarding a massive discrepancy in my private portfolio. She took one look at my face and immediately picked up her desk phone. Less than 2 minutes later, a young branch manager named Julian guided me into his glass-walled office. He offered me a bottle of water. I declined. I sat in the firm leather chair opposite his mahogany desk and told him to pull up my complete financial profile. Julian typed quietly on his keyboard. He smiled politely, clearly accustomed to older clients panicking over simple banking errors. He asked me what specific discrepancy I was concerned about. I told him to look at the recent activity linked to my primary estate. Julian clicked his mouse a few times. His polite smile slowly faded away. He leaned closer to his monitor. The silence in the small office stretched out, becoming heavy and suffocating. He cleared his throat and looked at me with a perfectly professional and completely detached expression. He informed me that my accounts appeared entirely in order. He stated that the recent loan distribution had been successfully processed, and the funds had been transferred exactly as I had requested. I stared at him. I asked him to explain exactly what loan he was referring to. Julian turned his monitor slightly so I could see the screen. He pointed to a bold green number at the very top of the ledger. He calmly explained that a home equity line of credit had been approved and fully extracted against the deed of my house. He read the number aloud. $600,000. The words hung in the freezing air of the office. $600,000. It was nearly the entire equity value of the home I had built with my own hands. I asked him how such a massive transaction could be authorized without my physical presence in the bank. Julian adjusted his glasses and clicked on a digital document. He explained that the modern banking system allowed for expedited digital lending for premium clients. He pulled up the final authorization forms. He pointed to the digital signature at the bottom of the page. It was a flawless replication of my handwriting. But more importantly, he explained the digital security verification. He told me that the loan had required two-factor authentication to bypass the final security wall. The bank had sent a secure 6-digit code to my registered cell phone. That code had been entered into the system perfectly. He read the timestamp of the authorization. It was 8:46 in the evening, 1 month ago. The exact moment I was walking my daughter down the long carpeted aisle of the reception hall. The exact moment my phone was sitting on a glass table in the groom's suite. The manager looked at me with mild concern. He reminded me that because the loan was secured against my property, the first monthly repayment would be automatically deducted in 5 days. If the payment failed, the bank would place a lien on my house. I realized right then that I was standing on the edge of a massive cliff. If I shouted, if I told Julian the money was stolen, the bank would immediately freeze everything. They would launch an internal investigation that could take years, and during those years, they would still hold the deed to my home as collateral. The money was already gone, moved to parts unknown by Matthew and Paul. If I panicked now, I would lose my house while the lawyers argued over the digital paperwork. I looked at Julian. I did not raise my voice. I did not show him my anger. I told him everything was fine. I said I just needed to verify the transfer dates for my personal records. I thanked him for his time. I stood up, pushed the heavy leather chair back, and walked out of the glass office. I walked across the gleaming marble floor and out into the blazing afternoon sun. The men who stole from me thought I was just a tired old man who would quietly accept defeat. They were completely wrong. I was going to destroy them. I parked my truck on the smooth asphalt of the driveway. The house standing in front of me was a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial with a wraparound porch and perfectly manicured hedges. I had purchased this house entirely in cash as a wedding gift for my daughter Natalie and her new husband Matthew. Sitting in the driver's seat, I stared at the pristine white front door. My hands resting on the steering wheel were trembling slightly. It was not from fear. It was from the absolute physical effort required to contain the rage boiling inside my chest. I closed my eyes and focused on my breathing. I inhaled deeply through my nose and exhaled slowly through my mouth. I repeated this process 5 times. I had to bury the truth deep down. I could not let them see the fury in my eyes. If I showed even a fraction of what I knew, the entire plan would collapse. I needed to become a hollow shell of the man I truly was. I needed to play the role of the tired and oblivious old father. I stepped out of the truck and walked up the stone pathway. Every single step felt like I was walking through deep water. My legs were heavy. My jaw was clenched so tight my teeth ached. Reaching the front porch, I stopped and forced my facial muscles to relax. I practiced a soft and gentle smile. I pressed the doorbell. The cheerful chime echoed inside the house. A few seconds later, the door swung open. Natalie stood there wearing a simple yellow sundress. Her face lit up with genuine happiness when she saw me. She wrapped her arms around my neck and hugged me tightly. I closed my eyes and hugged her back. The smell of her floral perfume reminded me of why I was doing this. I was not just protecting my money. I was protecting my only child from a monster she had unknowingly invited into her life. I stepped inside the spacious foyer. The house smelled of roasted garlic and fresh bread. It was the perfect picture of domestic bliss. Then I saw Matthew walking down the hallway. He was wearing an expensive cashmere sweater and holding a glass of dark red wine. The sweater was undoubtedly purchased with my stolen funds. He smiled widely and reached out his hand to greet me. The physical revulsion washing over me was almost entirely paralyzing. My brain was screaming at me to grab him by his collar and throw him through the front window. I forced my hand to extend forward. I grasped his hand and gave it a firm shake. His skin was warm. His grip was confident and arrogant. He looked me right in the eye and thanked me for coming to Sunday dinner. He called me Dad. The word felt like a physical blow to my stomach. I nodded politely and told him I was happy to be there. My voice sounded steady and completely normal. I even managed a small and completely fake chuckle. I followed them into the massive open-concept kitchen. The kitchen island was covered with expensive cheeses and imported meats. Matthew poured me a glass of water. I accepted the glass and leaned against the granite counter. I watched him interact with my daughter. He kissed her cheek and poured her more wine. He was playing the perfect husband. I sipped my water and watched his every move. The restraint was agonizing. Every second I spent in that house felt like a physical test of my endurance. But I remained perfectly quiet and perfectly calm. We moved from the kitchen island to the formal dining table. The heavy mahogany table was another expensive item I had purchased for them as a housewarming gift. Natalie brought out a large roasted chicken and placed it in the center of the table. I sat quietly at the far end while Matthew immediately took the head seat. He poured himself a second glass of imported red wine. He did not offer to refill my water glass. He leaned back in his custom-upholstered chair and sighed loudly. He looked at Natalie and told her that they needed to talk to the wedding planner about securing a partial refund. I stopped cutting my food. I looked up at him. I asked him what was wrong with the wedding. I had paid $80,000 for that single night. It was the most expensive event I had ever funded in my entire life. Matthew laughed condescendingly. He told me the catering was an absolute embarrassment. He said the filet mignon was overcooked, and the champagne tasted like cheap supermarket sparkling water. He looked directly at me and said he knew I was just a retired mechanic who did not understand high society events. He said he felt completely humiliated in front of his important business associates. He claimed his friends were accustomed to true luxury, and the reception I paid for made him look like a total failure. Natalie looked down at her porcelain plate. She quietly told Matthew that the food was perfectly fine and that everyone had a wonderful time. Matthew snapped at her instantly. He told her she simply did not understand corporate networking and high-level expectations. I sat perfectly still. The man sitting across from me had just stolen $600,000 from my personal bank account. He had used my digital identity to secure a massive fraudulent loan, and now he was sitting at the table I bought for him in the house I bought for him, complaining that the $80,000 party I threw for him was not luxurious enough. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw my plate across the room. I took a slow bite of my food and chewed it methodically. I asked him how his new business ventures were going. That was the perfect bait. Matthew absolutely loved talking about himself. His posture instantly changed. He leaned forward and began bragging about his massive new investments. He told me he was closing commercial deals that would change their lives forever. He used complex financial buzzwords that meant absolutely nothing to anyone with real business experience. He was desperately trying to sound like a wealthy Wall Street executive. Then he smoothly transitioned to his next trap. He told me that a man in his new elevated position needed to project an image of absolute success. He said his current luxury sedan was simply not good enough anymore. He needed a high-performance European sports car to drive clients around the city. He looked at me with a sickeningly sweet smile. He said he had already picked out the exact model he wanted. It was a customized vehicle that cost nearly $200,000. I placed my silver fork down on my plate. I asked him how he planned to finance such an incredibly expensive car. Matthew chuckled as if I had just asked a foolish question. He said his capital was completely tied up in his new real estate acquisitions. He looked me right in the eye and said he needed me to co-sign the auto loan. He presented it not as a request, but as a logical business strategy. He told me it was the absolute least I could do to support my daughter's future. He said my excellent credit score was just sitting there going to waste in my retirement. He even offered to let me drive the car once a month as a reward for my signature. The sheer audacity of his demand was physically nauseating. He had already secretly drained the entire equity of my home. Now he wanted to attach my name to a $200,000 debt just so he could parade around the city pretending to be a millionaire. I looked at Natalie. She looked incredibly uncomfortable. She quietly asked Matthew if they really needed another vehicle right now. Matthew ignored her completely. He kept his cold eyes locked directly on mine. He was testing my boundaries. He wanted to see how much money he could extract from the old mechanic before I finally pushed back. He viewed me as nothing more than a bottomless resource to be completely drained. I knew that if I refused too aggressively, he might become suspicious of my knowledge. I had to perfectly play the role of the tired old man who simply wanted to keep the peace. I picked up my cloth napkin and wiped my mouth. I let out a long, heavy sigh. I rubbed my temples as if I was confused and overwhelmed by his fast-talking business pitch. I told him my memory was not as sharp as it used to be, and I needed time to look over the vehicle paperwork. I said I would have my accountant review his loan application next week. Matthew smiled triumphantly. He truly believed he had won. He believed I was a weak and easily manipulated old fool. He raised his wine glass and offered a toast to family business. I raised my water glass and clinked it against his wine glass. I looked right through him. I absorbed every single insult and every ounce of his arrogance in pure silence. I decided right then to let him build his fragile castle of lies higher and higher. The higher he climbed, the more devastating his eventual fall would be. The dinner slowly came to an end. Natalie stood up to clear the heavy porcelain plates and carry them to the kitchen sink. Matthew remained firmly seated at the head of the table. He was busy scrolling through his expensive phone, completely ignoring his wife as she cleaned up after his meal. I pushed my chair back from the table and slowly stood up. I faked a slight groan, playing the part of an older man with stiff joints. I told them I needed to use the restroom before driving back to my house. Matthew did not even look up from his bright screen. He just waved his hand dismissively in my direction. I walked out of the formal dining room and down the short hallway. The sound of running water masked my footsteps as Natalie washed the dishes. As I passed the large granite kitchen island, something specific caught my eye. A thick stack of unopened mail was carelessly tossed near the coffee maker. Normally, I would never look at another man's private correspondence, but the arrogant thief sitting in the next room had completely forfeited any right to privacy. I stopped and looked down at the pile. The top envelope was thick and made of expensive textured paper. The return address featured the embossed gold logo of a premier commercial real estate brokerage firm located in the financial district. Beneath it was a heavy legal packet from a high-end title and escrow company. The transparent window of that envelope clearly displayed the name of a newly formed limited liability company. It was not registered in Matthew's personal name. It was a corporate entity completely detached from his identity. The pieces of the puzzle began snapping together in my mind with terrifying speed. Matthew had not stolen my money to simply buy expensive suits or luxury vacations. He had used the $600,000 from my home equity to fund a massive commercial property acquisition. I stood completely still in the quiet kitchen. The reality of the situation crashed over me like a heavy wave. The $600,000 was no longer sitting in a simple checking account waiting to be frozen by a bank manager. The money was already gone. Matthew and his father, Paul, had moved the stolen funds through a corporate shell company. They had successfully laundered my hard-earned wealth directly into a physical real estate asset. If the escrow packet was already sitting on the kitchen counter, it meant the transaction was either finalized or in the absolute final stages of closing. The money was now legally shielded behind a massive wall of corporate paperwork and offshore registry laws. My heart pounded heavily against my ribs, but my mind remained perfectly clear and entirely focused. I realized the trap was much deeper and far more dangerous than I had originally thought. This realization chained me to a terrifying new conflict. It completely changed my entire strategy. If I drove to the local police station right now and reported the identity theft, the authorities would eventually investigate and possibly arrest Matthew. But the legal process for federal wire fraud and corporate money laundering would take months, perhaps even years, to untangle. During that long investigation, the commercial real estate firm would legally hold the funds. The wealth management bank would still hold the fraudulent loan against the deed of my house. When the first massive monthly payment failed to clear my account next week, the bank would immediately begin foreclosure proceedings on my estate. I would literally become homeless while the federal courts slowly debated the criminal evidence. Calling the police was no longer a viable option. I could not rely on the standard justice system to save the house I built with my own hands. If I wanted my life back, I had to dismantle his corporate shield from the inside out before the bank took my home. I needed a specialized legal weapon. I walked away from the kitchen counter and headed toward the restroom. The simple theft had just transformed into a complex financial war, and I knew exactly who to call to help me fight it. I waited until Monday morning and drove straight to the downtown financial district. The morning traffic was incredibly heavy, but my mind was entirely focused on the coming war. I parked my truck outside a towering glass skyscraper. The directory in the grand lobby listed dozens of prestigious corporate firms, but I only needed the penthouse suite. I rode the private elevator up to the top floor. The steel doors opened to a sleek reception area lined with imported marble and modern art. The sharply dressed receptionist asked if I had a scheduled appointment. I did not answer her directly. I simply placed my driver's license on her polished desk. and told her to tell the senior partner that the mechanic was here. Less than 30 seconds later, the heavy oak doors of the corner office swung wide open. Benjamin Foster stepped out into the quiet lobby. Benjamin was a man who terrified other lawyers. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and possessed a formidable reputation for dismantling massive corporate empires with absolute ruthlessness. But when he saw me standing there, his sharp features softened into a genuine smile. He walked over and shook my hand firmly. 25 years ago, Benjamin was a broke law student who drove a rusted sedan with a blown engine. I had completely rebuilt his transmission for free so he could make it to his final state examination. 5 years after that, when he opened his own practice, my chain of auto repair shops became his very first corporate client. He never forgot the man who took a chance on him. I was the only person in the entire city who did not need an appointment to see him. He guided me into his massive office and closed the heavy doors behind us. The sound of the bustling city disappeared entirely, leaving us in absolute silence. He poured 2 cups of black coffee and sat across from me at his sleek glass conference table. I did not waste any time with pleasantries or small talk. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the printed photograph from the wedding reception. I placed it face up on the table. Next to the photograph, I placed a printed copy of the home equity loan documents I had retrieved from my bank manager. Finally, I told him about the commercial real estate mail I had seen sitting on the kitchen counter just 12 hours prior. I explained every single detail clearly and methodically. I told him exactly what my son-in-law had done. Benjamin did not interrupt me once. He listened with the cold and intense focus of a predator calculating its next strike. He picked up the photograph and studied the glowing laptop screen captured in the image. He set the photograph down and picked up the banking documents. His dark eyes scanned the forged digital signature. The warmth he had shown me in the lobby was completely gone. His face hardened into a mask of pure professional fury. He leaned back in his leather chair and steepled his fingers together. He told me that calling the local police would be a massive mistake. I nodded, confirming my own painful realization from the night before. He explained that if federal investigators froze the assets, now the bank would still foreclose on my property before the criminal trial even began. I looked him right in the eye and told him I did not want a standard police investigation. I told him I wanted to completely dismantle the thief who stole my future. I wanted to tear down his financial walls and reclaim my property legally and permanently. Benjamin smiled. It was a terrifying, deeply calculated smile. He pulled his laptop toward him and opened a secure investigative database. He told me that if Matthew had formed a corporate shell company to buy commercial real estate, there would be a paper trail hidden deep within the state registry. We just needed to find the exact structure of the corporate entity. The hunt for the stolen $600,000 had officially begun, and I had the most dangerous corporate lawyer in the city fighting right beside me. Benjamin turned his laptop screen slightly away from me to protect his secure passwords. For the next 20 minutes, the only sound in the massive corner office was the rapid and precise clicking of his keyboard. I sat perfectly still in the heavy leather chair. I watched his dark eyes scan line after line of glowing digital text. I have spent my entire life diagnosing broken engines by listening to the subtle rhythms of moving metal parts. Benjamin was doing the exact same thing with corporate data. He was listening for the lie. He was searching for the friction in the paperwork. He pulled up the state business registry and entered the name of the escrow company I had seen on the envelope sitting on Matthew's kitchen counter. He cross-referenced that specific name with the exact date and time the $600,000 was extracted from my bank account. The silence in the room grew incredibly heavy. I did not ask him any questions. I simply let him work. He finally stopped typing. He took a long sip of his black coffee and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the glass table. He told me that my son-in-law and his father were not amateur thieves. They had constructed a highly sophisticated financial maze. He explained that the initial $600,000 had not gone directly into a standard bank account. Instead, it was immediately wired into a holding trust located in a state with incredibly strict corporate privacy laws. From that holding trust, the money was divided into 3 separate transactions and funneled into an offshore limited liability company. Matthew and Paul had built a series of complex digital walls to ensure that if the bank ever came looking for the money, they would only find empty accounts and dead ends. They had intentionally designed the theft to be completely untraceable to the average investigator or local police detective. But Benjamin was not an average investigator. He possessed access to proprietary financial databases that normal citizens never even knew existed. He bypassed the privacy shields of the holding trust by tracking the secondary tax identification numbers attached to the offshore company. He followed the digital footprints left by the massive escrow transfer. 10 minutes later, he hit the absolute bottom of the maze. He turned the laptop screen around so I could see it clearly. Displayed on the large monitor was a high-resolution satellite image of a massive commercial property located on the rapidly developing west side of the city. It was a newly constructed luxury strip mall featuring high-end retail spaces, a massive parking lot, and an anchor grocery store. Benjamin pointed directly at the screen. He told me that was exactly where my money went. Matthew had used my $600,000 as the primary cash down payment to secure a multi-million-dollar commercial mortgage for that specific property. I stared at the aerial photograph of the sprawling shopping center. The sheer scale of the betrayal was almost impossible to process. While Matthew was sitting at my dining room table complaining about the expensive wedding I paid for, he was already the secret owner of a massive commercial development funded entirely by my stolen wealth. He had stolen my past to buy himself an empire. Benjamin printed the official property deed and the corporate registration documents. He laid the thick stack of warm papers on the glass table between us. He told me the property was currently fully leased and was projected to generate hundreds of thousands of dollars in passive rental income every single year. Matthew had secured a lifetime of extreme wealth using my forged digital signature as the absolute foundation. I felt a cold knot form tight in my stomach. The complexity of their plan meant that simply walking into a police station would be completely useless. The corporate veil protecting that shopping center was incredibly thick and legally binding. If I tried to claim the money was stolen, Matthew would simply point to the corporate registry and claim I was a confused old man who had willingly invested in his business venture. The bank would believe the signed paperwork over my verbal protests. The title company would defend the transaction to protect their own liability. I looked at Benjamin and asked him how we could possibly pierce through such a fortified legal structure. I asked him how we could take down a fully registered commercial entity without destroying my own financial standing in the process. Benjamin did not answer me immediately. He picked up the last page of the printed property deed. His dark eyes narrowed sharply. He read the final paragraph of the document again. The cold confidence on his face suddenly vanished entirely. He looked up at me with an expression of absolute horror. He told me there was something else hidden deep in the paperwork, something far worse than the stolen money. Benjamin slid the heavy paper across the smooth glass table. His hand was visibly trembling. This was a man who had faced down federal prosecutors and billionaire executives without ever blinking. But right now he looked genuinely sick to his stomach. He pointed his silver pen at the bottom of the final page. It was the master operating agreement for the offshore limited liability company that now owned the massive commercial strip mall. He told me to read the section regarding the primary guarantor of the commercial mortgage. I leaned forward and looked closely at the dense legal text. My eyes scanned the complex paragraphs until I reached the signature line at the very bottom. There, printed clearly in black ink, was the name of the sole managing member and the primary guarantor of the entire multi-million-dollar debt. It was not Matthew. It was not Paul. It was the name of my only daughter, Natalie. I stopped breathing entirely. The air in the massive corner office felt as heavy as wet concrete. I stared at her perfectly forged signature. I traced the curves of the letters with my eyes. It was an absolute masterpiece of deception. Matthew had not just stolen my money. He had built a massive fraudulent empire and placed the entire legal burden directly onto the shoulders of his own wife. I looked up at Benjamin. My voice was nothing more than a harsh whisper when I asked him to explain exactly what this meant. Benjamin took a deep breath and removed his glasses. He rubbed his eyes tiredly before giving me the devastating legal reality. He explained that Matthew had structured the corporate entity to completely insulate himself. On paper, Matthew was nothing more than an unpaid consultant for the company. Natalie was legally registered as the sole owner and the absolute financial guarantor of the entire operation. The gravity of the situation began to crush me. Benjamin laid out the exact consequences of this horrific trap. He told me that the $600,000 used to fund this company was stolen through wire fraud and identity theft. Those were severe federal crimes. If I went to the police and exposed the theft, the federal government would immediately investigate the offshore company. And when the federal agents looked at the corporate registry, they would not find Matthew. They would find Natalie. They would see her forged signature on the banking documents. They would see her name on the commercial deed. Benjamin looked me right in the eye and delivered the final, fatal blow. He said that if this massive fraud was exposed today, Natalie would be the primary target of a federal indictment. She would be the one facing decades in a federal prison for money laundering and bank fraud. A cold and terrifying numbness spread from my chest down to my fingertips. Matthew had never intended to just steal my retirement fund. He had calculated every single variable with pure psychopathic precision. He knew that eventually I might discover the missing money and the fraudulent home equity loan. He knew I might try to fight back. So he had intentionally constructed the ultimate human shield. He had tied my daughter to the tracks of his own crimes. He knew that I would never take an action that would send my own child to a federal penitentiary. He believed he had trapped me in an impossible situation. If I stayed silent, I would lose my home, and he would keep his stolen empire. If I spoke out, I would destroy my daughter's life forever. He thought he had completely paralyzed me with my own paternal love. I sat back in the heavy leather chair and closed my eyes. The image of Natalie smiling in her yellow sundress yesterday afternoon flashed into my mind. She was so completely innocent. She believed she was married to a successful and loving businessman. She had absolutely no idea that her husband had forged her name on federal documents and placed a massive target on her back. The anger I had felt the previous night at the dinner table was entirely gone. It was replaced by something much darker and far more powerful. It was the absolute and uncompromising instinct of a father protecting his child from a deadly predator. I opened my eyes and looked at Benjamin. The fear and panic that Matthew relied on did not exist inside me. I did not feel paralyzed. I felt an absolute freezing clarity. I told Benjamin that the mission had just changed. This was no longer just about recovering my stolen $600,000. This was no longer about saving my house from bank foreclosure. This was a rescue operation. We had to surgically extract Natalie from this federal trap before the bank realized the money was stolen. We had to completely sever her legal ties to the offshore company without Matthew or Paul ever realizing what we were doing. And once my daughter was safely removed from the blast radius, I was going to detonate Matthew's entire life. Benjamin slowly put his glasses back on. The professional fury returned to his dark eyes. He nodded his head in silent agreement. The stakes were absolute life and death, and we were about to go to war. I stood up from the glass table and walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling window in Benjamin's office. I looked out over the sprawling city skyline. The towering buildings represented billions of dollars in corporate wealth and complex legal structures. I did not care about any of it. I told Benjamin that every single dollar in my bank account was completely worthless if my daughter ended up in a federal courtroom. I needed him to figure out a way to break the legal chains connecting Natalie to that fraudulent company. The money was a secondary concern now. The absolute only priority was surgically extracting my child from the disaster her husband had created. Benjamin leaned back in his heavy leather chair and tapped his silver pen against the glass table. He explained that corporate liability was not something we could simply erase with a quick phone call or a standard legal injunction. Because Natalie was registered as the primary guarantor, her name was permanently stamped onto the commercial mortgage. He told me the only legal way to remove her from the blast radius without triggering a federal investigation was to execute a total and voluntary transfer of liability. Someone else had to willingly step forward and legally assume the entire burden of the offshore limited liability company and the multi-million-dollar debt attached to it. If we tried to force the issue through the courts, Matthew would immediately realize we knew about the theft, and he would flee the country, leaving Natalie to face the federal prosecutors alone. I turned away from the bright window and looked directly at Benjamin. I told him there was only one person arrogant enough and greedy enough to willingly step into a federal trap. That person was Matthew. Benjamin stopped tapping his pen. He looked at me with a mixture of surprise and intense professional curiosity. He asked me how I possibly planned to convince a man who had just stolen $600,000 to voluntarily sign a document taking full legal responsibility for his own massive fraud. I walked back to the conference table and sat down heavily in my chair. I told Benjamin that Matthew possessed a fatal flaw. His entire existence was built on pure, unadulterated greed and a desperate need to feel superior to everyone around him. He truly believed I was a weak and oblivious old mechanic who was easily manipulated. He believed he was the smartest person in any room. I told Benjamin we were going to use his massive ego directly against him. We were going to offer him a prize so incredibly large and so intoxicating that he would blindly sign absolutely anything to get his hands on it. I explained my strategy. I told Benjamin I was going to invite Matthew to a private lunch without Natalie. I would play the pathetic role of a sick and dying old man who simply wanted to secure his legacy before his health failed completely. I would offer Matthew complete legal control of my remaining $2 million stock portfolio. I would tell him I wanted to transfer the assets directly to him in order to spare Natalie the immense stress of managing the complex taxes. Benjamin slowly smiled. His dark eyes lit up with absolute brilliant realization. He understood exactly what kind of trap I was building. He said he could draft a massive stack of asset transfer documents for the stock portfolio. He would expertly bury a corporate liability reassignment clause deep within the 50 pages of dense and confusing legal jargon. By signing the papers to accept the fake $2 million gift, Matthew would unknowingly assume 100% singular liability for the offshore company. He would legally sever Natalie from the mortgage and claim the entire fraudulent operation as his own personal burden. Benjamin immediately opened his laptop and began typing the documents that would become Matthew's absolute destruction. I invited my son-in-law to lunch on a Wednesday afternoon. I told him I needed to discuss family finances and that I wanted to treat him to his favorite restaurant in the financial district. The place he chose was excessively loud and entirely pretentious. It had dark lighting, expensive, abstract art on the walls, and menus without any prices listed. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat in a leather booth near the back. I spent those 10 minutes physically preparing myself for the performance of my life. I slumped my shoulders forward. I practiced making my breathing sound slightly shallow and labored. When Matthew finally walked through the heavy glass doors, he was 20 minutes late. He did not apologize for keeping me waiting. He slid into the booth opposite me and immediately signaled the waiter for a glass of imported whiskey. He looked at me with clear annoyance, as if this lunch was a massive inconvenience to his highly important schedule. I let my hands tremble slightly as I picked up my water glass. I took a slow sip and intentionally spilled a single drop onto the white tablecloth. Matthew rolled his eyes and looked away in disgust. He hated weakness, and I was giving him exactly what he expected to see. I cleared my throat and spoke in a voice that was noticeably softer and thinner than usual. I told him I had visited my primary physician earlier that week. I paused and looked down at my hands. I told him the doctor had discovered a serious issue with my heart. I used the exact medical terminology I had memorized the night before. I painted a grim picture of a failing cardiovascular system and a very short timeline. Matthew stopped looking at the restaurant decor. His eyes snapped back to me. The annoyance on his face vanished instantly, replaced by a sharp, calculating intensity. He was doing the math in his head. He was calculating how quickly he could get his hands on whatever I had left. I leaned across the table and looked at him with fake desperation. I told him that building my auto repair shops had consumed my entire life. I said my only goal was to ensure my daughter was completely protected when I was gone. I told him my liquid assets were secure, but my primary investment portfolio was becoming incredibly complicated. I said I had $2 million tied up in a high-yield stock portfolio. I let that number hang in the air between us. $2 million. I saw his pupils dilate slightly. His jaw tightened. The predator inside him was completely focused on the bleeding prey sitting across the table. I told him that transferring those specific stocks through a standard inheritance process would subject Natalie to massive capital gains taxes and endless probate court hearings. I said Natalie was too emotionally fragile to handle that kind of financial stress while mourning my death. Then I pushed the poisoned bait directly toward him. I told him I wanted to bypass the standard inheritance laws entirely. I wanted to execute a living transfer of the entire $2 million portfolio directly into his sole control. I framed it as a desperate plea for help. I told him he was a brilliant businessman and that he was the only person I trusted to manage the wealth and protect my daughter. I said I wanted to sign the portfolio over to him completely and quietly. I told him Natalie did not even need to know about the transfer until everything was settled. I said it would be our little secret, a massive financial safety net managed solely by him. Matthew tried to hide his massive smile by taking a slow sip of his whiskey. He failed completely. His arrogance and his greed blinded him to every single red flag in my story. He did not ask for a second medical opinion. He did not express any genuine sorrow about my failing heart. He simply nodded with a grave expression and told me I was making the smartest business decision of my entire life. He reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. His grip was strong and incredibly condescending. He promised me he would take the heavy burden off my shoulders. He told me he would personally handle all the complex legal paperwork so I could just rest and enjoy my final days in peace. I looked down at his hand resting on top of mine. I nodded weakly and thanked him for his incredible generosity. Inside my chest, my heart was beating with absolute, perfect strength. The fish had completely swallowed the hook, and he had absolutely no idea he was already dead. Matthew leaned back in the leather booth. The imported whiskey sat completely forgotten on the white tablecloth. I watched his mind work behind his cold eyes. He was not thinking about my failing heart. He was thinking about $2 million. He was imagining the luxury cars he could buy and the absolute power he could wield over his corporate friends. He let out a long and heavy sigh. He practiced a look of deep concern and reached across the table to pat my arm. He told me he was incredibly honored by my immense trust. He said he knew exactly how hard I had worked in my auto shops my entire life. He promised me he would treat my financial legacy with the absolute utmost respect. His voice dripped with sickeningly fake sincerity. It took every single ounce of my willpower to keep my hands resting calmly on the table. I just nodded slowly and stared down at my glass of ice water. Matthew then shifted his tone entirely. He adopted the arrogant persona of a seasoned financial expert speaking to a deeply confused child. He told me that managing a high-yield portfolio was incredibly complex. He said the federal tax implications alone would completely crush someone without his high level of corporate experience. He leaned forward and lowered his voice to a quiet, conspiratorial whisper. He enthusiastically agreed that telling Natalie about the money was a terrible idea. He said my daughter was far too emotional and completely lacked the required business acumen to handle this kind of sudden wealth. He actually claimed she would probably just want to waste it or put it in a useless low-interest savings account. He looked me right in the eye and told me that as her husband, it was his absolute duty to protect her from this massive financial burden. He masterfully framed his own pure greed as an act of loving sacrifice. I coughed weakly and asked him if he was truly willing to take on the sole legal responsibility for the transfer. Matthew smiled warmly. He told me not to worry about a single thing. He said he had an entire team of corporate lawyers who handled this sort of basic paperwork every single day. I immediately raised my hand to stop him. I told him I wanted my own personal attorney to draft the final documents. I explained that I had a very specific way I wanted the transfer legally structured to avoid any immediate state tax audits. I said my lawyer had already started drafting the preliminary contracts. For a brief second, I saw a distinct flash of hesitation in Matthew's eyes. He absolutely hated losing control of the legal process. But the sheer intoxicating allure of $2 million free dollars completely overpowered his natural caution. He nodded his head in agreement. He eagerly asked how quickly my lawyer could have the documents ready to sign. The absolute desperation in his voice was unmistakable. He was terrified I might suddenly pass away before he got his hands on my remaining money. I told him the legal papers would be ready by Friday morning. I suggested he come to my house so we could sign everything in absolute privacy while Natalie was away at her office. Matthew agreed instantly. He pulled out his expensive cell phone and blocked out his entire Friday morning schedule right in front of me. He looked up and smiled a cold, victorious smile. He told me I was finally making a truly smart investment. He finished his glass of whiskey in one large swallow. He stood up from the leather booth and smoothed his tailored designer suit. He dropped a single $50 bill on the table for his drink and walked out of the dark restaurant without ever looking back. He honestly believed he had just manipulated a dying old man out of his entire life savings. He had absolutely no idea he had just enthusiastically volunteered to step directly onto the financial guillotine. Friday morning arrived with a heavy gray overcast. I sat alone at my kitchen table listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Natalie had left for her office 2 hours earlier. The house was completely silent. I had placed a thick stack of legal documents right in the center of the wooden table. Beside the documents sat a single black ink pen. At exactly 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I did not rush to answer it. I walked slowly, dragging my feet slightly to maintain the illusion of my failing health. I opened the front door to find Matthew standing on my porch. He was wearing a sharp navy blue suit and holding a leather briefcase. He looked incredibly eager. He offered a practiced smile and asked how I was feeling today. I told him I was just tired. I stepped aside and let him walk directly into the trap. I led him into the kitchen and motioned toward the table. I sat down heavily and let out a long breath. Matthew took the seat across from me. His eyes instantly locked onto the massive stack of paper. It was exactly 50 pages of the most dense and complex corporate legal jargon Benjamin Foster could possibly write. I told Matthew that my attorney had worked all night to finalize the portfolio transfer. I explained that the documents were incredibly thorough to ensure the state tax agencies could not freeze the assets during the transition. I pushed the stack across the smooth wood surface. I told him the first 20 pages outlined the specific high-yield stocks and the current market valuation. That was the shiny lure. I knew he would not be able to resist looking at the numbers. Matthew pulled the stack closer and began to flip through the first section. His eyes traced the columns of stock tickers and the massive financial totals. I saw his breathing become slightly shallow. The sheer magnitude of $2 million was completely intoxicating to him. He was so completely blinded by his own greed that he did not pay any attention to the remaining 30 pages of the contract. He did not know that Benjamin had constructed a flawless legal maze designed specifically to destroy him. Buried deep within the fourth section, under a completely mundane heading about tax liability consolidation, was the corporate liability reassignment clause. It was an absolute masterpiece of legal deception. The clause did not simply state that Matthew was taking over a debt. It used highly technical corporate restructuring language. It stated that the receiving party, acting as the primary financial manager, actively absorbed all singular liability for any and all limited liability companies currently associated with the guarantor. It specifically referenced the exact state registry numbers of the offshore shell company Matthew had created. By signing the document, Matthew was legally declaring that he was the sole operator and the absolute primary guarantor of the fraudulent commercial mortgage. Furthermore, the clause explicitly released Natalie from any and all past, present, and future financial obligations tied to that specific corporate entity. It completely severed her legal connection to the stolen money and the forged banking documents. I watched him turn the pages. My heart beat with a steady, cold rhythm. I told him he should probably have his own legal team review the contract before he signed anything. It was a calculated psychological push. I knew that suggesting he delay the process would only make him more desperate to finalize it. Matthew immediately shook his head. He let out a condescending chuckle. He told me he was perfectly capable of reading a standard asset transfer agreement. He claimed he dealt with contracts 10 times this complex every single day. He wanted the $2 million right then and there. He did not want to risk me changing my mind or my heart failing before the ink was dry. He reached across the table and picked up the black pen. He turned to the very first signature line on page 15. He signed his name with a swift and arrogant flourish. He flipped the page and signed again. I sat perfectly still and watched him execute his own downfall. He signed the tax waivers. He signed the asset receiving acknowledgments. Then he reached page 42, the corporate liability reassignment clause. He did not even pause to read the paragraph above the dotted line. He simply placed the tip of the pen against the paper and signed his full legal name. He willingly claimed 100% of the fraudulent company. He willingly took the federal wire fraud and the massive stolen mortgage directly onto his own shoulders. He completely freed my daughter from the terrifying trap he had built for her. He continued flipping pages and signing his name until he reached the very end of the massive packet. He signed the final date and pushed the stack of papers back across the table toward me. He dropped the pen and smiled a wide, victorious smile. He told me I had made a very wise decision for my family. He stood up from the table and buttoned his suit jacket. He promised me he would start managing the portfolio that exact afternoon. I pulled the heavy stack of documents toward my chest. I looked up at him and offered a weak, grateful nod. I told him I finally felt like everything was exactly where it belonged. Matthew turned and walked out of my house, completely convinced he was a millionaire. I listened to the sound of his expensive car starting in the driveway and pulling away down the street. The moment the house was completely silent again, I picked up my phone and called Benjamin Foster. I told him the fish was in the boat, and it was time to prepare the federal warrants. I stood perfectly still by the front window and watched Matthew walk down my driveway. I did not move a single muscle until he reached his expensive vehicle. He did not start the engine right away. He opened the heavy car door and sat in the driver's seat. He immediately pulled his phone from his pocket. I knew exactly who he was calling. I walked away from the window and sat back down at my kitchen table. I opened my personal laptop and accessed the live feed from the security camera I had installed above my garage door earlier that week. The camera was equipped with a highly sensitive directional microphone. I turned the volume on my computer speakers all the way up. The audio was crystal clear. I heard the sharp ringing tone from Matthew's phone speaker. A few seconds later, his father answered the call. Paul sounded busy and slightly annoyed. Matthew did not even bother saying hello. He practically shouted into the phone that they had just secured another $2 million. He laughed loudly and called me a pathetic and broken old man. He told his father that I had practically begged him to take complete control of my entire stock portfolio. He bragged about his own brilliant negotiation skills. He claimed he had completely manipulated me into signing away my life savings without my daughter ever knowing a single thing. I sat in my quiet kitchen and listened to the young thief celebrate his fake victory. But the celebration did not last very long. The voice coming through the computer speakers suddenly changed. Paul was not a foolish amateur driven by blind arrogance. Paul was a seasoned financial predator who understood exactly how corporate traps were built. Paul did not congratulate his son. He demanded to know exactly what kind of paperwork Matthew had just signed. Matthew casually mentioned the 50-page legal packet. He said it was just standard tax waivers and asset transfer agreements. The silence that followed from Paul was incredibly heavy and filled with absolute dread. Paul raised his voice for the first time. His tone was sharp and completely unforgiving. He asked Matthew why a simple stock portfolio transfer required 50 pages of dense corporate legal text. He asked why a man who spent his entire life building a business would suddenly hand over $2 million to a son-in-law without securing a secondary trust for his own daughter. Paul recognized the massive red flags immediately. He told Matthew that wealthy men do not simply give away their fortunes out of pure generosity. They hide their wealth. They protect it. Paul realized that his son had just blindly walked into a legal maze without any protection at all. Matthew tried to defend himself. He argued that he had read the first 20 pages and saw the stock valuations with his own eyes. Paul cut him off completely. He ordered Matthew to stop talking and start driving. He commanded his son to bring the entire physical packet of signed documents directly to his private office at the bank. Paul stated that his own elite legal team was going to tear every single page apart, line by line. He told Matthew not to contact any brokers and not to file a single piece of paper with the state registry until the lawyers confirmed exactly what he had signed. Matthew argued for another brief second before finally giving up. He sounded completely deflated and deeply nervous. He slammed his car door shut and started the engine. The tires squealed loudly against the asphalt as he sped away from my house. I slowly closed my laptop and let out a long breath. The silent phase of my plan was officially over. The ticking clock had just started. Benjamin needed exactly 48 hours to process the liability transfer through the federal courts and lock the trap permanently. If Paul and his lawyers discovered the hidden reassignment clause before the registration was finalized, they would file an emergency injunction to block the transfer. They would realize we knew about the stolen $600,000. The entire element of surprise would be completely destroyed. The next 48 hours would determine if I saved my daughter or lost absolutely everything. The invitation to the grand opening celebration arrived by courier on a Saturday morning. Matthew was not hosting a simple gathering. He was throwing a massive luxury event to unveil the commercial strip mall he had purchased with my stolen money. The party was scheduled for that exact evening. I knew he only invited me to show off his new empire and to humiliate me in front of his wealthy associates. I accepted the invitation willingly. I wanted to see the absolute peak of his arrogance before I tore it all down. I drove my old work truck across the city as the sun began to set. The sky turned a dark shade of purple as I pulled onto the newly paved road leading to the commercial center. The sheer scale of the property was staggering. It was not just a small building. It was a sprawling complex of high-end retail stores with massive glass storefronts and modern architectural designs. Huge floodlights illuminated the pristine brickwork and the expensive landscaping. It looked like a fortress of absolute wealth. And every single brick, every single pane of glass, and every blade of manicured grass was paid for by the $600,000 stolen from the equity of my home. I pulled my weathered truck into the massive parking lot. The lot was completely filled with imported sports cars and luxury utility vehicles. There was a red carpet rolled out in front of the primary anchor store. A team of valets wearing crisp white shirts and black bow ties were busy parking the expensive vehicles. A large jazz band was playing lively music on a temporary wooden stage. Waiters in tailored uniforms circulated through the massive crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with expensive champagne and imported caviar. It was a sickening display of unearned luxury. I parked my truck in a dark corner of the lot, far away from the valet stand. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet cabin for a moment. I looked down at my hands. They were rough and calloused from decades of hard, honest labor. I had earned every single dollar I ever possessed by rebuilding engines and fixing broken machines. I knew the true value of hard work. The people standing on that red carpet knew absolutely nothing about hard work. They only knew how to consume and steal. I stepped out of my truck and walked slowly toward the glowing lights of the party. I wore a simple gray suit. It was clean and pressed, but it was obviously old. As I approached the edge of the crowd, several guests turned to look at me. They scanned my worn shoes and my outdated suit. Their eyes were filled with quiet judgment and polite disgust. They parted to let me through, treating me like an unwelcome ghost haunting their beautiful celebration. I did not care about their silent insults. I kept my eyes focused entirely on the center of the massive room. Matthew was standing near the edge of the wooden stage holding court, surrounded by a circle of local politicians and wealthy real estate developers. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than my first car. He held a crystal glass of champagne in his right hand. He was laughing loudly and slapping his associates on the back. He looked like a conquering king. He was completely drunk on his own perceived brilliance. He believed he owned the massive building we were standing in. He believed he had successfully stolen my life savings. He believed he had trapped my daughter in a federal crime. And most importantly, he believed he was absolutely invincible. I stood in the shadows near a large concrete pillar and watched him celebrate his stolen empire. The anger that had burned inside me all week was completely gone. I only felt a cold and absolute calm. I was a mechanic watching a machine that was about to rip itself apart. Matthew turned his head and scanned the large crowd. His eyes locked directly onto mine. The loud laughter stopped. A slow, malicious smile spread across his face. He whispered something to his wealthy friends and handed his champagne glass to a passing waiter. He began walking straight toward me. The arrogant thief was about to demand his final piece of tribute. Matthew walked right up to me with a group of his wealthy investors trailing close behind him. He stopped just a few feet away and looked me up and down. He let out a loud, dramatic sigh and shook his head. He turned to his friends and introduced me as his father-in-law. He made sure to emphasize the word father in a tone dripping with pity. He told them I was a simple, retired mechanic who was not used to such extravagant high society events. The investors offered me tight, polite smiles, but their eyes were completely empty. Matthew then took a step closer to me. He lowered his voice just enough to sound conspiratorial, but kept it loud enough for his associates to hear every single word. He told me that my worn gray suit was completely ruining the upscale aesthetic of his grand opening celebration. He said I looked like a lost pedestrian wandering through a private luxury resort. He told me it was deeply embarrassing for him to have his important business partners see his family looking so incredibly cheap and out of place. I did not react. I simply stared at his perfect white teeth and his expensive silk tie. Then Matthew smiled a cruel and twisted smile. He turned around and snapped his fingers loudly at the young man managing the main valet stand. The attendant quickly ran over and handed Matthew a stack of plastic-numbered tickets and a black uniform vest. Matthew turned back to me and shoved the vest directly into my chest. He told me that 2 of his hired valets had called in sick for their shift. He said the parking lot was getting completely backed up, and his incredibly important guests were being forced to wait in their vehicles. He looked me right in the eye and told me that since I already looked like the hired help, I might as well make myself useful to the company. He demanded that I put on the black vest and go park cars for the rest of the evening. He said it would be a very good way for me to earn my keep instead of just standing around drinking his expensive imported champagne. The wealthy investors standing directly behind him chuckled softly at the cruel and demeaning joke. They waited eagerly for me to explode. They fully expected me to throw the vest on the ground and shout at him in blind anger. Matthew desperately wanted a public spectacle to prove his absolute dominance over me in front of his peers. I looked down at the cheap black fabric resting in my hands. I felt the cold plastic of the parking tickets pressing against my palm. I did not yell. I did not throw a childish tantrum. I simply looked back up at Matthew and nodded my head once. I told him I would be completely happy to help out with the parking situation. I slipped the black uniform vest directly over my old gray suit jacket. I buttoned it up slowly and methodically right in front of him. The arrogant smile on Matthew's face faltered for just a fraction of a second. He was deeply confused by my absolute and immediate compliance. He expected a desperate fight for dignity, but I gave him total submission. I took the heavy stack of tickets from his hand and turned my back on him. I walked completely away from the glowing lights of the party and headed straight toward the dark parking lot. I did not feel humiliated. I did not feel broken or defeated. I felt the cold and satisfying weight of absolute control. I was going to park his luxury cars for a little while, and then I was going to watch the federal government take his entire life away. I took the first set of keys from a man wearing a silver watch that likely cost more than my first home. He did not look me in the eye when he handed them over. I slid into the driver's seat of his imported German sports car. The leather was pristine, and the engine hummed with a quiet and terrifying power. As I gripped the steering wheel, my mind did not fill with shame. I did not feel degraded by performing manual labor for men who thought they were better than me. Instead, the smell of the gasoline and the soft vibration of the engine block beneath my feet transported me back 45 years. I was not always a wealthy man. I did not inherit a massive trust fund or a portfolio of commercial real estate. I started my life at the very bottom, working in a damp and freezing garage on the south side of the city. I spent my youth covered in thick black motor oil and heavy grease. Back then, I worked 12-hour shifts pulling apart broken engines and rebuilding transmissions. I learned very early on that every single machine, no matter how expensive or how complicated, operates on a set of absolute rules. If you understand those rules, you can control the machine. I learned how to listen to the rhythm of moving parts. I learned how to identify the exact source of a problem just by the pitch of a grinding gear or the faint smell of burning rubber. I built my entire life on that fundamental understanding of mechanics. I saved every dollar I earned and eventually bought my own small repair shop. Then I bought another one until I owned a massive chain across the entire state. But I never forgot how it felt to turn a heavy steel wrench. I never lost the cold and calculating mindset of a master mechanic. Parking those luxury cars under the bright floodlights of the strip mall, I felt that exact same sense of absolute control. Matthew thought he was humiliating me. He thought the black valet vest was a symbol of my defeat. He was entirely wrong. The vest was just a work uniform, and I was completely comfortable going back to work. I drove a sleek black sedan toward the far end of the parking lot. I shifted the gears smoothly and listened to the engine purr. Matthew was exactly like a poorly built engine. He was flashy on the outside, covered in expensive paint and polished chrome. But internally, he was entirely defective. He had built his massive financial machine using stolen parts and forged documents. He had completely ignored the fundamental rules of the system he was trying to manipulate. When you build an engine with stolen and mismatched parts, it might run beautifully for a short period of time. It might sound powerful, and look incredibly impressive to people who do not know any better. But the internal friction is always there. A master mechanic knows exactly where the weak points are hiding. I had spent the last week finding every single weak point in Matthew's fraudulent corporate structure. Working with Benjamin, I had essentially loosened the primary bolts holding his entire life together. The corporate liability reassignment clause he eagerly signed was the absolute fatal flaw in his design. I parked the black sedan perfectly between the painted white lines and turned off the ignition. The sudden silence inside the car mirrored the cold silence in my heart. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked back across the dark asphalt to collect the next set of keys. I watched Matthew standing on the brightly lit wooden stage holding his crystal glass of champagne. He was laughing and celebrating the incredible power of his newly built machine. He had absolutely no idea that the oil was already draining out of the engine block. He had no idea that the pistons were about to lock up permanently. I took the keys to a massive silver utility vehicle from another wealthy investor and smiled politely. I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. I was not a humiliated old man. I was the architect of his absolute destruction. I was just taking my time and waiting patiently for the entire machine to blow apart. I parked the last luxury vehicle of the hour and walked slowly back toward the glowing center of the grand opening celebration. The lively jazz music suddenly stopped. A sharp feedback whine echoed from the large speakers positioned around the temporary wooden stage. The massive crowd of wealthy investors and local politicians began to quiet down and gather closely around the platform. I stood at the very edge of the bright floodlights. I kept the cheap black valet vest buttoned tightly over my gray suit. I folded my hands perfectly still in front of me and watched the stage. Matthew stepped up to the microphone. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and smiled a brilliant and entirely fake smile at the sea of expectant faces. He tapped the microphone twice and thanked everyone for attending the launch of his new commercial empire. He began his public toast by talking about the incredible value of hard work and relentless dedication. Listening to him speak was like listening to a perfectly rehearsed stage play. He spoke with deep and artificial passion about the sleepless nights he spent planning this massive real estate acquisition. He claimed he had built his financial portfolio from absolutely nothing. He painted a completely fictitious picture of himself as a brilliant visionary who had pulled himself up by his own bootstraps through sheer willpower and unmatched corporate intellect. He did not mention the $600,000 he stole from my bank account. He did not mention the digital signature he forged or the federal laws he violated. He stood under the bright white lights and claimed my entire life savings as his own personal triumph. The crowd listened with rapt attention. They nodded in agreement and raised their crystal glasses every time he paused for dramatic effect. Matthew was completely intoxicated by their adoration. His ego swelled to massive proportions. He transitioned his speech from praising his own fake achievements to criticizing the people he claimed held society back. He started talking about the outdated mentalities of the older generation. He said the world of modern business moves too fast for men who refuse to adapt. He claimed that true progress requires leaving the weak and the cautious behind in the dirt. He was building up to a specific target, and I knew exactly who it was. He wanted one final moment of absolute superiority to crown his grand opening celebration. Matthew suddenly stopped pacing across the wooden stage. He turned his body and looked directly through the crowd toward the dark edge of the parking lot. He locked his cold eyes directly onto mine. He raised his hand and pointed his finger right at me. The entire sea of wealthy guests turned their heads to follow his gesture. They stared at the old man wearing the black valet vest. Matthew spoke directly into the microphone. He told the crowd that true success means outgrowing the relics of the past. He said there are people who spend their entire lives working with their hands, getting completely covered in dirt and grease, only to end up with absolutely nothing to show for it. He called me a relic. He said men like me were perfectly suited for parking the cars of men like him. A low murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. A few of the younger executives actually chuckled at the cruel and entirely public insult. They looked at me with open pity and polite disgust. They expected me to look down in shame. They expected me to shrink away into the shadows of the dark parking lot and hide my face. But I did not move a single inch. I stood perfectly tall and kept my eyes locked directly on Matthew. I did not feel a single ounce of shame or anger. I only felt the cold and absolute certainty of a man who holds the detonator in his hand. Matthew was standing on a stage built entirely of stolen wood and borrowed time. He was bragging to a crowd of people who would completely abandon him the second the federal government froze his bank accounts. He was a dead man celebrating his own funeral. Every single word he spoke was just another piece of evidence confirming his profound and incurable arrogance. Matthew raised his crystal glass of imported champagne high into the air. He offered a final arrogant toast to the future of his massive commercial empire. He declared that nothing could possibly stop his continued rise to the absolute top of the financial world. The crowd erupted into loud and enthusiastic applause. They raised their own glasses and cheered for the successful young thief. I did not clap. I did not cheer. I slowly raised my left arm and pulled back the sleeve of my cheap gray suit jacket. I looked down at the face of my old mechanical wristwatch. The second hand swept methodically across the dial. The 48-hour waiting period Benjamin Foster required to lock the corporate liability trap was officially over. I lowered my arm and looked back up at the stage. The music started playing again, but it sounded distant and hollow. The tension in the air was so thick, it felt like heavy static electricity. I just stood there in the absolute calm before the storm, waiting for the heavy steel doors of justice to slam completely shut. The applause from the wealthy investors was still ringing in the cool night air. Matthew took another sip of his expensive champagne, completely intoxicated by his own perceived brilliance. He turned to accept a handshake from a prominent local politician. I kept my eyes locked on the entrance of the massive parking lot. I did not have to wait very long. The disruption did not start with a loud siren or a shouted warning. It started with a sudden and visual shock. A line of 4 heavy black utility vehicles turned off the main road and aggressively bypassed the red velvet ropes of the valet stand. They did not slow down to speak with the attendants. They drove with absolute and terrifying purpose directly onto the pristine brick walkway leading toward the wooden stage. The heavy rubber tires crushed the expensive landscaping and sent perfectly manicured flowers flying across the ground. The aggressive movement caught the attention of the crowd instantly. The lively jazz music sputtered and died as the band members stopped playing their instruments in sheer confusion. The loud, cheerful chatter of the party guests vanished completely. It was replaced by a collective gasp of shock. The 4 black vehicles stopped in a perfect tactical formation, completely surrounding the brightly lit platform. Red and blue emergency lights began flashing silently, reflecting off the massive glass storefronts of the new commercial center. The flashing lights painted the shocked faces of the local politicians and wealthy developers in harsh and terrifying colors. Matthew lowered his crystal glass. His arrogant smile disappeared. He stepped forward to the edge of the stage and demanded to know what was happening. He shouted loudly that this was private property and a closed corporate event. He expected the intruders to immediately apologize and back down. He was entirely accustomed to his newly stolen wealth protecting him from all real-world consequences. He actually threatened to call the chief of police and have the drivers arrested for trespassing. But the heavy doors of the black vehicles swung open simultaneously, and his fake reality began to crumble instantly. Men and women wearing dark tactical windbreakers stepped out into the bright floodlights. The bold yellow letters printed across their backs clearly identified them as federal agents. They were accompanied by several heavily armed uniformed local county sheriffs. The officers quickly formed a secure perimeter around the plaza, effectively trapping the wealthy guests and the confused investors. The partygoers immediately backed away from the stage. They scrambled over each other, trying to distance themselves from the sudden law enforcement presence. They could smell the danger, and nobody wanted to be standing next to the target. Then the rear door of the lead vehicle opened. Benjamin Foster stepped out into the cool night air. He was not wearing tactical gear. He wore his perfectly tailored charcoal suit and carried a thick leather briefcase. He looked like an absolute executioner stepping onto the gallows. He walked calmly and methodically through the parting sea of terrified guests. He did not look at the local politicians. He did not look at the expensive cars or the beautiful commercial architecture. His dark, piercing eyes were locked entirely on Matthew. I stood silently in my cheap black valet vest just a few feet away from the wooden platform. I watched Benjamin approach the stage with the federal agents flanking him on both sides. The absolute silence in the massive courtyard was entirely deafening. The fraudulent machine had officially locked up. The stolen engine was completely dead. The strike had arrived right on schedule, and there was absolutely no escape. Benjamin Foster stepped smoothly onto the wooden platform. He did not raise his voice, and he did not shout. He did not need to. The silence in the massive courtyard was so profound that his calm words carried across the entire crowd. He stood directly in front of Matthew. He looked at the young man with absolute professional disgust. Paul immediately pushed his way through the circle of terrified investors. He stepped up onto the stage and tried to physically place himself between his son and my attorney. Paul puffed out his chest and used his deep, authoritative voice. He demanded to know exactly who Benjamin was and what gave him the right to interrupt a private corporate function. He threatened to call the bank executives and ruin Benjamin permanently. Benjamin did not even blink. He simply turned his head and nodded toward the lead federal agent standing at the edge of the stage. The agent stepped forward and firmly shoved Paul backward. The agent then reached into his tactical jacket and produced 2 thick manila envelopes. He handed them directly to Benjamin. Benjamin held the heavy envelopes up under the bright white floodlights. He announced to the entire crowd that he was the senior legal counsel representing my estate. He stated clearly that he was acting in direct coordination with the Federal Financial Crimes Division. A collective gasp rippled through the sea of wealthy guests. The local politicians who had just been shaking hands with Matthew suddenly turned pale and began slowly walking backward toward the parking lot. Benjamin opened the first envelope and pulled out a thick stack of official warrants stamped with the federal seal. He looked Matthew right in the eye and began to read the charges out loud. He did not rush. He let every single word land like a physical blow. He stated that Matthew was being served with a federal indictment for wire fraud. He detailed the exact unauthorized extraction of $600,000 from my personal home equity account. He read the charge of aggravated identity theft. He explicitly described the digital forgery used to bypass the bank security protocols on the night of his own wedding. He announced that the massive commercial property they were standing on was purchased entirely with stolen funds. Matthew physically stumbled backward as if he had been pushed. The crystal glass slipped from his fingers and shattered loudly against the wooden floorboards. The expensive imported champagne soaked into his custom-tailored shoes. He started shaking his head wildly. He stammered and stuttered, claiming it was all a massive misunderstanding. He looked out at the crowd of investors and begged them to listen to him. He claimed my lawyer was lying, but the wealthy developers and corporate partners did not offer him any support. They looked at him with absolute horror. They had just invested their own money into a commercial property that was now the center of a massive federal criminal investigation. They turned their backs on him entirely. Benjamin then turned his cold, dark gaze toward Paul. He opened the second manila envelope and pulled out another set of federal warrants. He announced the criminal charges against the arrogant banker. He read the charge of conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud. He stated the charge of aiding and abetting financial theft. He detailed exactly how Paul had used his elite position at the wealth management bank to help his son launder the stolen $600,000 through a complex web of offshore holding companies. He announced that the federal government was officially revoking Paul's banking license and freezing his entire pension effective immediately. The older man stood completely frozen. His face turned an ashen gray, and his knees began to tremble violently. The lead federal agent gave a short command. 4 officers moved instantly onto the stage. They did not ask politely, and they did not read them their rights quietly. They grabbed Matthew roughly by the shoulders and spun him around. They pulled his arms forcefully behind his back and secured heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The loud metallic clicking sound echoed sharply across the quiet courtyard. They did the exact same thing to Paul. The 2 arrogant men who had spent the entire evening bragging about their incredible business intellect were now physically restrained, like common thieves in front of the entire city. I stood at the edge of the stage and watched the entire process unfold. I felt the rough, cheap fabric of my black valet vest. It felt like a badge of absolute honor. The grand opening celebration was completely destroyed. The massive brick building behind the stage no longer looked like a symbol of wealth and power. Surrounded by flashing red and blue emergency lights, the sprawling commercial center looked exactly like what it truly was. It was a massive financial cage, and the men who built it were never going to walk free again. The first phase of the trap had snapped perfectly shut, but the most devastating part of my plan was still waiting to be revealed. The heavy steel handcuffs bit deeply into Matthew's wrists. The physical reality of the cold metal finally shattered the illusion he had lived in for the past month. He twisted his body aggressively, trying to pull his arms free from the grip of the federal agents. The officers simply tightened their hold and forced him to stand completely still under the harsh white floodlights. Matthew looked out at the massive crowd of wealthy investors standing in the courtyard. Just 5 minutes ago, they were cheering for him and hanging on to his every word. Now they were whispering to each other and stepping further away from the wooden stage. He realized absolutely nobody was coming to help him. His father was standing right next to him, completely paralyzed by his own impending ruin. Matthew turned his frantic gaze toward Benjamin Foster. His breathing became incredibly shallow and rapid. The smooth, arrogant corporate executive was entirely gone. He was replaced by a desperate and cornered animal willing to do absolutely anything to survive the night. Matthew decided to play the final card he had hidden up his tailored sleeve. He stopped struggling against the federal agents and stood up straight. He looked directly at the lead officer and raised his voice so the entire courtyard could hear him. He claimed the federal government was making a massive and humiliating mistake. He stated that he did not own the offshore limited liability company holding the commercial mortgage. He shouted that he was nothing more than an unpaid consultant, helping his wife manage her complex real estate portfolio. He threw Natalie entirely under the bus without a single second of hesitation. He told the federal agents that if there was stolen money involved, they needed to go arrest my daughter immediately. He claimed Natalie was the sole owner and the primary guarantor of the entire fraudulent operation. He actually manufactured a complete lie right on the brightly lit stage. He said Natalie had forced him to attend the wedding reception while she stayed behind in the private suite to process the forged banking documents. He publicly blamed the woman who loved him unconditionally for every single federal crime he had committed. I stood at the edge of the wooden platform and listened to him betray my only child. I felt absolutely no surprise. I knew his soul was completely rotten from the very beginning. The federal agents did not look impressed by his loud and desperate confession. They simply turned their attention back to Benjamin. Benjamin Foster did not look angry. He looked entirely satisfied. He slowly opened his thick leather briefcase and pulled out a crisp manila folder. He extracted a single piece of paper from the folder. It was page 42 of the massive legal packet Matthew had eagerly signed in my kitchen just 48 hours ago. Benjamin held the paper up under the bright lights for the federal officers to see. He told Matthew that his desperate defense was entirely inaccurate. He explained that a corporate audit had been conducted earlier that week. He stated that the original operating agreement listing Natalie as the primary guarantor was no longer a legally binding document. Matthew blinked rapidly as the panic in his eyes intensified. He demanded to know exactly what Benjamin was talking about. Benjamin calmly explained the legal concept of a corporate liability reassignment. He told Matthew that the Federal Registry had received and completely verified a new binding contract that exact morning. Benjamin read the specific clause out loud to the entire silent crowd. He read the exact legal phrasing stating that the receiving party actively absorbed all singular liability for the offshore company and completely released the previous guarantor from any and all financial and criminal obligations. Benjamin lowered the paper and looked Matthew directly in the eye. He told the young thief that he had legally claimed absolute and total ownership of the fraudulent mortgage when he signed the fake stock transfer agreement on Friday morning. Benjamin pointed directly at the black ink signature resting at the bottom of the page. He told Matthew that his own blinding greed had forced him to sign a total confession. He had willingly stepped into the center of a federal trap just to get his hands on $2 million that never even existed. Benjamin explained that the entire stock portfolio transfer was a complete fabrication designed specifically to trigger the liability reassignment. There was no $2 million gift waiting for him. There was only the heavy burden of federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. Natalie was completely severed from the offshore company and absolutely safe from any criminal prosecution. Matthew had taken the entire blast radius directly onto his own shoulders. The color drained completely from Matthew's face. The realization hit him with the force of a speeding freight train. He looked at the signature on the paper and recognized his own hasty handwriting. He remembered sitting in my quiet kitchen laughing at me in his head while he quickly signed every single page without reading a single word. He remembered how desperate he was to take the fake money before my heart failed. He had built a massive and complex corporate shield to protect himself, and then he had eagerly dismantled it with his own pen. He realized he had not outsmarted a dying old mechanic. He had been completely outmaneuvered and utterly destroyed. His legs suddenly gave out completely. The federal agents had to physically hold him up by his arms to keep him from collapsing onto the wooden floorboards. He started hyperventilating. He looked at his father, Paul, but the older man just stared blankly at the ground, entirely broken by his own ruined life. Matthew finally turned his head and looked directly at me. He saw me standing there in the cheap black valet vest. He saw the absolute calm in my eyes. He finally understood that I had orchestrated his entire downfall from the very beginning. The wealthy investors watched in absolute silence as the young man who had promised them endless riches openly wept on the brightly lit stage. Matthew remained on his knees on the wooden stage. He was gasping for air, as if the oxygen had been completely sucked out of the courtyard. The federal agents kept their hands firmly on his shoulders, ensuring he could not move. But Benjamin Foster was not entirely finished. The brilliant corporate attorney looked down at the broken young man with absolute zero sympathy. Benjamin reached into his thick leather briefcase one final time. He pulled out a single document printed on heavy blue legal paper. He held it down so Matthew could clearly see the bold text at the very top. He announced to the silent crowd that he was executing a formal confession of judgment. Matthew stared blindly at the blue paper. His mind was too fractured to comprehend any more legal terminology. Benjamin leaned down slightly and forced him to listen. He explained that when Matthew signed the massive stack of papers in my kitchen, he did not just claim criminal liability, he also signed a legally binding financial surrender. Benjamin explained the mechanics of the trap with cold and surgical precision. He stated that the offshore shell company was originally funded by the $600,000 stolen from my personal home equity account. Because the foundational capital was acquired through federal wire fraud, the entire corporate structure was legally invalid. The massive commercial mortgage Matthew secured was based entirely on stolen collateral. Benjamin raised his voice so the wealthy investors standing in the parking lot could hear every single word. He announced that according to federal asset recovery laws, property purchased with stolen funds must be surrendered to compensate the original victim. He looked Matthew right in the eye and delivered the ultimate financial guillotine. He told the young thief that the massive commercial strip mall they were currently standing on no longer belonged to his offshore company. It did not belong to the wealthy investors, and it did not belong to the bank. The legal deed to the entire multi-million-dollar property had automatically reverted to the primary victim of the fraud. Benjamin pointed his silver pen directly at me. The silence in the courtyard was absolute. Matthew slowly turned his head and looked at the sprawling brick buildings. He looked at the glowing floodlights and the expensive glass storefronts. He had spent months negotiating the land purchase. He had hired the architects and supervised the massive construction project. He had poured every ounce of his energy and his stolen wealth into building a monument to his own arrogance. And in a single perfectly calculated legal maneuver, he had handed the entire empire directly over to the old mechanic he despised. He had literally built a fortress just to surrender the keys to me. He realized he was not just going to federal prison. He was going completely bankrupt. Benjamin twisted the legal knife one final time. He calmly informed Matthew that the federal government was immediately freezing all of his personal bank accounts. The luxury sports cars parked in his driveway would be seized by the authorities before midnight. The expensive designer suit he was wearing was quite literally the only thing he had left in the entire world. He was left with absolutely nothing but massive debt and a guaranteed federal prison sentence. His father, Paul, would face the exact same complete financial ruin. They had tried to steal my retirement, and instead, they had legally purchased my absolute financial supremacy. I stood quietly at the edge of the stage. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I did not need to say a single word. The financial guillotine had dropped flawlessly. The trap I designed had executed its precise function. I watched the federal agents pull Matthew back to his feet. He was completely limp. The arrogant fire in his eyes was entirely extinguished. He looked like an empty shell. They guided him down the wooden steps and walked him slowly toward the waiting black vehicles. The flashing emergency lights illuminated his tear-stained face. The wealthy investors parted to let the criminals pass, without saying a single word of comfort. I unbuttoned the cheap black valet vest and let it fall to the ground. My work here was finally done. The federal agents did not show a single ounce of gentleness as they moved Matthew toward the waiting vehicles. The heavy steel handcuffs clinked sharply with every single step he took. The sound echoed across the silent courtyard, cutting through the cool night air like a knife. The massive crowd of wealthy investors and local politicians remained completely frozen in place. They watched the young man they had just been cheering for being dragged away like a common street criminal. The bright, flashing red and blue lights from the federal vehicles painted the entire scene in harsh, alternating colors. Paul was walking just a few steps ahead of his son. The older banker looked completely hollow. His shoulders were slumped forward, and his head was bowed entirely in defeat. He knew the federal prison system inside and out. He knew exactly what was waiting for them. The absolute reality of their permanent ruin hung heavy over the sprawling commercial center they had built with my stolen money. Matthew, on the other hand, could not accept his new reality. He fought against the firm grip of the federal officers. He twisted his shoulders and dragged his expensive custom-tailored shoes against the rough brick walkway. He was sobbing openly now. The arrogant and untouchable corporate executive was completely gone. In his place was a terrified and desperate child who had finally been caught stealing. He looked back over his shoulder toward the brightly lit wooden stage. He looked at the massive glass storefronts of the property he had legally surrendered just moments ago. He was breathing so heavily that his chest heaved against his ruined silk tie. The agents had to physically force him to keep moving forward. They pushed him toward the open rear door of the black utility vehicle. The dark interior of the truck represented the absolute end of his life as a free man. He planted his feet firmly on the ground, refusing to step inside. He began scanning the crowd of silent onlookers with wild, terrified eyes. He was desperately searching for a lifeline. He was looking for anyone who could save him from the nightmare he had created for himself. That was exactly when the crowd of wealthy guests began to part. They stepped aside slowly, creating a clear path through the center of the courtyard. Walking down that path was my beautiful daughter, Natalie. She was wearing a simple dark dress and a long woolen coat. I had called her exactly 1 hour before the federal agents raided the grand opening celebration. I had asked her to meet me at the commercial center, but I had not told her why over the phone. I had my attorney Benjamin Foster meet with her in private right before she arrived. Benjamin had shown her the photographs from the wedding. He had shown her the forged banking documents with her perfectly copied signature. He had explained every single horrific detail of her husband's betrayal. Natalie knew absolutely everything, but Matthew did not know that. When Matthew saw his wife walking toward the federal vehicles, his terrified face lit up with a sudden burst of desperate hope. He truly believed she was entirely ignorant of his crimes. He believed she was just an emotional and easily manipulated woman who would do absolutely anything to protect her husband. He threw his upper body forward, straining against the strong grip of the federal agents. He screamed her name across the silent courtyard. His voice was completely broken and filled with manufactured panic. He begged her to come closer. He shouted that there had been a terrible misunderstanding. He looked her right in the eyes and lied with absolute flawless conviction. He told her that my lawyer had framed him. He claimed that jealous business rivals were trying to steal their commercial real estate empire. He pleaded with her to call his corporate legal team immediately. He begged her to empty their personal bank accounts and pay whatever bail the federal court demanded. He cried real tears and told her he loved her more than anything in the entire world. He promised her that if she just helped him get out of those heavy steel handcuffs, he would fix absolutely everything. He used her deep, unconditional love as his absolute final weapon. He expected her to run to his side right then and there. He expected her to scream at the federal officers and demand his immediate release. He expected her to play the role of the devoted and heartbroken wife completely blinded by loyalty. I watched the entire pathetic display from my positions near the empty wooden stage. I watched the man who had stolen my life savings acting like a helpless victim. He was putting on a masterful performance of innocence and terror. The wealthy investors standing nearby began to whisper among themselves again. Some of them actually looked confused by his desperate pleas. Matthew was so incredibly convincing that he almost made the federal arrest look like a genuine mistake. He poured every single ounce of his manipulative charm into his performance. He kept pulling against the heavy metal chains binding his wrists, reaching out toward Natalie, as if he were drowning in a deep ocean. He called her his beautiful angel. He told her she was the only person in the world he could truly trust. He spun a massive web of lies right there in the flashing red and blue emergency lights. The sheer audacity of his deception was almost impressive. He was facing decades in a federal penitentiary, and his immediate instinct was to try and completely drain the emotional reserves of the woman he had just tried to frame for his crimes. He simply could not stop using people. It was the only way he knew how to live. Natalie stopped walking when she was exactly 3 feet away from the federal agents. She stood completely still under the harsh glare of the flashing emergency lights. Matthew was still crying and rambling about jealous rivals and fake conspiracies. He expected her to fall to her knees and weep for him. He expected her to defend him against the federal officers. But Natalie did not shed a single tear. Her beautiful face was an absolute mask of cold and calculated disgust. She looked at the man she had promised to spend her life with just 1 month ago. She looked at his ruined designer suit and his tear-stained cheeks. She did not see a loving husband standing in front of her. She saw a pathetic and greedy thief who had tried to build a financial empire by destroying her entire family. Matthew finally stopped talking. The absolute silence from his wife unnerved him more than the heavy steel handcuffs on his wrists. He sniffled and asked her if she heard what he said. He begged her to tell the agents to let him go. Natalie took one step closer to him. She did not reach out to touch him. She did not offer him any comfort. Her voice was incredibly steady and completely devoid of any affection when she finally spoke. She told him to stop insulting her intelligence. She told him that his pathetic performance was completely over. She stated clearly and loudly that she had spent the last hour sitting in a quiet office with my corporate attorney. Matthew froze completely. His eyes widened in absolute horror as Natalie began to dismantle his entire web of lies with ruthless precision. She told him she had seen the high-resolution photograph taken through the cracked door of the private dressing room. She told him she saw him and his father huddled over the silver laptop using my stolen phone to bypass the bank security codes. She told him she had read the federal loan documents. She looked him right in the eye and said she had seen her own forged signature resting at the bottom of the offshore company registration. She told him she knew exactly how he had planned to let her take the fall for his massive federal crimes. Matthew opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His ultimate manipulation had failed completely. He realized that the woman he thought was incredibly weak and easily controlled was actually just as strong as the mechanic who raised her. Natalie looked at him with profound pity. She told him that his absolute biggest mistake was underestimating the bond between a father and his daughter. She said he was so blinded by his own greed that he completely failed to understand what true loyalty actually looks like. She told him that every single word he had ever spoken to her was nothing but a calculated and toxic lie. Natalie reached into the deep pocket of her long woolen coat. She pulled out a thick, folded legal document. She held it up so he could see the official stamp of the family court on the front page. She told him Benjamin Foster did not just draft corporate liability transfers this week. He also drafted an expedited filing for absolute divorce based on massive financial fraud and criminal deception. Because Matthew's hands were heavily chained behind his back, Natalie could not hand the papers directly to him. Instead, she stepped forward and shoved the thick legal document forcefully into the front breast pocket of his ruined suit jacket. She looked at him one final time. She told him she never wanted to hear his voice or see his face ever again. She turned her back on him completely. Matthew screamed her name. The sound was guttural and filled with absolute terrifying despair. He thrashed against the federal agents, begging her to come back. Natalie did not flinch. She did not turn around. She walked smoothly and confidently through the parted crowd of silent investors. She walked straight over to the dark edge of the courtyard and stood right beside me. She reached out and wrapped her hand tightly around my rough, calloused arm. We stood together in absolute solidarity, watching the federal agents finally push her ex-husband into the dark interior of the transport vehicle. The federal courthouse was entirely different from the bright and glamorous lights of the grand opening celebration. The air inside the courtroom was incredibly stale, and the wooden benches were hard and uncomfortable. Matthew sat at the defense table wearing a standard oversized orange uniform. His custom-tailored designer suits and his expensive silk ties were completely gone. Because the federal government had immediately frozen every single bank account tied to his name and his offshore company, he could not afford to hire a private defense attorney. He was forced to rely on an overworked public defender who took one single look at the signed liability reassignment clause and strongly advised him to plead guilty. Matthew tried to negotiate his way out of the trap. He tried to offer information to the prosecutors. He tried to claim he was manipulated by his father. But the federal prosecutors did not need his help or his confessions. They had Benjamin Foster to thank for a meticulously prepared and absolutely undeniable paper trail. The federal judge looked down from the high wooden bench with absolute zero tolerance for corporate theft and family betrayal. The judge specifically noted Matthew's cowardly attempt to frame his own innocent wife as an aggravating factor in the sentencing phase. The gavel fell with a loud and terrifying crack. Matthew was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and aggravated identity theft without any possibility of early parole. Paul faced an even more spectacular and complete professional destruction. He had spent 30 long years building an elite reputation in the downtown financial district. He had rubbed elbows with billionaire investors and powerful corporate executives. The Federal Banking Commission completely dismantled that 30-year reputation in exactly 3 days. They permanently revoked all of his financial licenses and issued a binding order banning him from ever stepping foot inside a banking institution or managing financial assets ever again. The wealth management bank he worked for immediately fired him. The board of directors fully cooperated with the federal investigators to avoid their own massive corporate scandal. To cover the federal fines and the court-mandated restitution, the government seized his entire retirement pension. They liquidated his primary residence, his luxury vehicles, and his expensive vacation properties. Paul stood before the exact same federal judge and received a 12-year sentence for conspiracy to commit wire fraud and aiding and abetting financial theft. The proud and arrogant man who used to approve multi-million-dollar loans from a comfortable leather chair was now assigned to fold uniforms in the laundry room of a minimum security prison. The financial fallout extended far beyond the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom. The Federal Asset Forfeiture Division descended on Matthew's remaining life like a swarm of hungry locusts. They arrived at his house with large flatbed trucks and towed away the imported sports cars he had proudly driven around the city. They completely emptied his home of the expensive modern furniture, the imported art, and the designer watches he had purchased using the stolen funds. Every single item of value was carefully cataloged and sold at a public government auction to help pay the massive legal fees and court costs he had accumulated. His entire luxurious existence was reduced to a small stack of printed auction receipts. The offshore limited liability company he had used to hide my money was completely dissolved by federal mandate. The complex and highly sophisticated corporate shield he had built with his father was completely shattered into a million useless pieces. Matthew and Paul were left with absolutely nothing but their federal identification numbers and the heavy steel bars on their cell doors. While their lives were being completely and systematically dismantled, Benjamin Foster worked quietly and efficiently to rebuild my absolute financial security. He presented the federal confession of judgment directly to the board of executives at my wealth management bank. Faced with the overwhelming and highly public evidence of internal fraud, facilitated by their own senior branch manager, the bank immediately surrendered. They officially canceled the fraudulent home equity line of credit entirely. They issued a formal letter of apology and completely removed the massive financial lien from the deed of my house. I did not lose a single penny to bank fees or fraudulent interest charges. Furthermore, the federal court officially verified my sole ownership of the commercial strip mall. Because the massive property was purchased with my stolen funds, the title was legally transferred into a secure blind trust controlled entirely by me. The massive financial machine Matthew had built to elevate his own ego was now fully operational, but it was generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in passive rental income entirely for my family. The courts had finally restored the natural order of things, completely erasing the thieves and rewarding the absolute patience of a silent and calculating father. I did not keep the commercial strip mall. I had absolutely no desire to become a corporate landlord or manage retail leases. To me, that massive brick building was nothing more than a dark monument to greed and betrayal. Within a week of the federal court transferring the deed into my blind trust, I listed the entire property with a highly reputable commercial broker. Because the development was brand new and fully occupied by successful businesses, it sold in less than 14 days to a legitimate investment firm. The final sale price was significantly higher than the original fraudulent mortgage. I took the heavy cashier's check directly to the young branch manager at my wealth management bank. I sat in his cold glass office and watched him process the payment. I paid off the $600,000 home equity line of credit in full. The heavy financial chain that had been wrapped tightly around my neck was completely shattered. I walked out of the bank that afternoon with my estate completely secure and a massive surplus of clean, honest money added to my retirement accounts. Natalie did not want to stay in the beautiful colonial house I had purchased for her wedding gift. The walls of that home held too many toxic memories of the man who had tried to completely destroy her future. We packed up her personal belongings and hired a professional crew to remove the expensive furniture. We sold that house just a few weeks later. Natalie used her portion of the equity to buy a quiet, comfortable townhouse closer to the city and closer to her own career. She spent the first few months in intensive therapy working through the profound emotional trauma of the betrayal. But she did not break. She proved to be incredibly resilient. Without the constant suffocating weight of her ex-husband and his relentless, arrogant demands, she began to truly thrive. She secured a major promotion at her corporate office. The dark shadows under her eyes entirely disappeared, replaced by a genuine and peaceful light. Our relationship, which he had tried so desperately to sever, became stronger than it had ever been. We survived the devastating storm together, and we emerged completely unbroken. It is a beautiful Sunday afternoon now. The sky is a clear, pale blue, and the weather is perfectly warm. I am sitting in the backyard of my estate, resting in a sturdy wooden chair I built myself many years ago. I am not wearing a cheap black valet vest or an uncomfortable tailored suit. I am wearing old, comfortable jeans and a faded cotton shirt. Natalie is sitting right across from me. She just poured us both a glass of fresh iced tea. We do not have expensive imported champagne or fragile crystal glasses. We do not have a crowd of wealthy investors clapping for us. We only have the quiet sound of the wind blowing through the old oak trees and the absolute certainty that we are perfectly safe. The fraudulent empire has been completely dismantled. The toxic elements that tried to poison our lives have been permanently eradicated. The natural order of my family has been completely restored. I look at my beautiful daughter, and I realize that true wealth has absolutely nothing to do with commercial real estate or massive stock portfolios. True wealth is the ability to sit in your own backyard in complete peace, knowing that the people surrounding you genuinely love you. I learned that you cannot buy loyalty, and you can never trust a man who values status over family. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones we invite into our own homes and seat at our own dining tables. But I also learned that patience and cold calculation will always defeat blind arrogance. I am Stephen. I am 71 years old, and I protected my family the only way a master mechanic knows how. I found the broken parts, and I removed them permanently. Thank you for listening to my story today. If you found my journey helpful, please leave a comment below and let me know your thoughts. Do not forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more stories of justice and survival. Stay safe and always protect the people you truly love. The greatest lesson I took from this entire ordeal is that true power does not reside in loud anger or immediate emotional reactions. When you are betrayed by someone you trusted, your first instinct is to fight back in the heat of the moment. But the absolute most devastating weapon you can wield against an arrogant predator is complete silence. Silence gives you the clarity to observe their mistakes and the time to build a flawless defense. I learned that you must never allow the pain of betrayal to blind your strategic judgment. Sometimes you have to let the thieves believe they have won, so they will carelessly walk right into their own destruction. If you believe that patience and strategic silence are the best ways to defeat toxic people, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of absolute justice.